They told me Kay was dead. I was the one who killed it. Drove a jury-rigged plasma lance through its chest cavity in the lower hold of Outpost Fenris, while Charnetsky bled out on the deck beside me. I watched Kay's body go dark. I watched the bioluminescent filaments in its skin stop firing one by one like a city losing power block by block. I stood there in the cold and the smoke. And I waited, because I am not the kind of man who walks away from something like that without making sure. And when the last light in it finally died, I turned around, picked up what was left of my partner, and carried him out. That was 5 years ago. What I have not been able to see anyone fully understand, in 5 years of trying, is what the thing at Fenris actually was. Reports describe it as an alien bioweapon of uncertain origin found aboard an abandoned insertion pod that had been orbiting the Fenris system for an estimated 300 years. They describe its physical capabilities in measured clinical language: enhanced musculature, rapid adaptive healing, capacity for biological integration of non-organic materials. And that language is accurate the way a topographic map of a mountain is accurate. It tells you the elevation. It does not tell you what it feels like to stand at the base and look up. Kay was not a creature in the way a man is a creature, with a continuous self that moves through space and time and makes choices based on fear and desire and memory. Kay was a mechanism, a weapons program written in biology rather than code, designed with one operational objective and an apparently unlimited capacity for pursuing it. It did not hate, it did not want. Processed available input and generated output, and the output was always the same: more K, more integrated, more resilient, more capable. The only time in 40 hours at Fenris that I saw anything in K's behavior that resembled a choice was when it bypassed 2 sealed rooms that contained living personnel in order to spend time in the machine shop instead. That was not restraint. That was optimization. It was building itself before it came. I understand now that I was never afraid of K the way I was afraid of other things that had tried to kill me. I was afraid of K the way you are afraid of a structural failure. Not because of its intent, but because of its indifference. Intent you can reason with, or exhaust, or deceive. Indifference just continues. 5 years. And I spent most of them pushing paper at a transit depot on Meridian Station, which is exactly the kind of assignment the brass gives to men they consider unstable assets. Men who have seen something that doesn't fit the approved categories. Men who won't stop talking about it. I filed 3 follow-up reports in the first year after Fenris. Each one was received, acknowledged, and filed in the classified research queue, which is the bureaucratic equivalent of a drawer that locks from the outside. I requested access to alien insertion pod catalogs twice, and was denied both times on the grounds that the material was under active research review. I requested a formal briefing on what the fleet knew about the entity's origin, and whether other insertion pods of the same design had been recovered. Request was acknowledged. No briefing was scheduled. I was 47 years old, and my left knee sounded like gravel in a tin can every time I climbed a ladder. I had a quarters billet the size of a freight container, and a recurring nightmare that the filaments in Kay's skin hadn't all gone dark, that one of them had kept going, that somewhere in the dark of the lower hold, something had held on. Commander Rella found me in the depot commissary at 0600 on a Tuesday. She set a data chip on the table next to my coffee and sat down across from me without being invited. She was a young officer, 30, maybe 32, with the kind of carefully neutral face that people in her position practice in front of mirrors. She said my name and rank like she'd rehearsed it. I didn't touch the chip. She told me the salvage crew aboard the derelict warship Charnetsky had gone silent 18 hours earlier. The Charnetsky, my partner's namesake vessel, commissioned posthumously the year after Fenris. An old Merizian-class heavy destroyer that had been limping back from the KL border, under tow, after taking an enemy boarding action. Boarding hadn't breached the crew compartments. The automated countermeasures had fired and sealed the corridors before the alien insertion pods could fully deploy. Crew had been evacuated. The ship was being towed in for analysis and refit. A salvage team had gone aboard 3 days ago. 12 personnel, 4 engineers, 2 armory techs, and 6 women from the labor rehabilitation program The fleet ran for non-violent offenders working off their sentences in exchange for hazard reduction on derelict hulls, the kind of program the brass liked, because it kept the labor rolls full and gave the lawyers something humane to point to. The salvage team had gone silent. Last transmission from the ship's automated systems had flagged a biohazard signature in the secondary cargo hold, the same hold that the alien bot pods had targeted before the countermeasures sealed. Picked up the chip. I turned it over in my hands. I set it back down. I asked Rella if anyone had told her what we found at Fenris. She said she'd read the file. I asked her if she believed it. She didn't answer that. She told me a rapid response team was being staged. She told me my read on the situation, on what might be aboard that ship, was the most operationally relevant intelligence the fleet had. She told me they needed someone who had seen K and survived. I told her there were no other candidates. She didn't argue with that either. I drank the rest of my coffee. It had gone cold. I told her I'd go. I told her I'd need the incident file from Fenris. Not the redacted public version, the complete technical file, and access to the fleet's current catalog of alien insertion pod design specifications. She said she could have both on my data chip within the hour. I said that would do. What I did not tell her was that I had not needed the file. I had spent 5 years with the Fenris event in my head, with the kind of clarity that comes from reviewing something repeatedly in the dark at 3 in the morning. I knew the insertion pod's design the way I knew my own bad habits. I knew K's physical parameters at every stage of its development, the way a former soldier knows the sound of the weapon that nearly killed him. Not academically, but in the body, in the reflex layer that sits below conscious thought. I needed the file for one thing only: to see how much of what I knew the fleet had also managed to learn in 5 years. The answer, when I read it in the shuttle, was approximately a third. They had the physical parameters. They had the integration capacity. They had the behavioral observations from the Fenris incident report. What they did not have, what my reports had argued and what 3 classified follow-up reviews had politely declined to formally accept, was the adaptive intelligence assessment. The understanding that K was not simply a very capable biological weapon, but a learning system. That the adaptation was not random mutation but directed optimization. That the entity was, in the functional sense of the word, aware of what it was doing, even if awareness in K meant something completely different from what it meant in a human being. Fleet preferred not to accept this because the implications of accepting it were uncomfortable. An adaptation was something you planned for. An intelligence was something you had to negotiate with the possibility that you could never fully outpace, which was not a concept the fleet's weapons development division enjoyed committing to paper. The shuttle that took me out to the Charnetsky was a cramped 6-seater with a cracked viewport seal that someone had patched with polymer tape. The response team was 4 people. A combat medic named Pilar, 2 security rangers named Rochelle and Mavis, and a young fleet investigator named Brooke, whose job was officially described as on-site incident documentation, and whose actual job, based on the way she watched everyone, was to decide whether this became a classified incident or a public record incident. The distinction mattered to someone back at headquarters. It did not matter to me. His partner, a cop named Sean, had hitched a ride on the same shuttle in a civilian liaison capacity. He was young, dark-eyed, and the kind of calm that either means excellent training or insufficient imagination. He spent the transit reading the same data file 3 times. I could tell because I watched him. I spent the transit looking at the Charnetsky through the cracked viewport. She was big. A Meridian-class destroyer runs 400 meters, bow to stern, with a spine like a scarred axe blade and engine pods that droop like broken wings when the power is off. Charnetsky was dark except for the emergency running lights, which threw thin red lines along her hull and the blue-white glow of the tow cables keeping her in stable drift. Her hull plating was scored from the boarding action. Long lateral burns, where the alien insertion pods had tried to cut through before the countermeasures fired. Some of the panels were missing entirely, replaced with emergency foil that rippled in the drift current like the ship was breathing. She looked dead. I had seen enough dead things to know they don't always stay that way. We docked at the secondary airlock, on the port midship, which the manifest said was still fully pressurized and atmosphere certified. The airlock cycled correctly. Corridor lights inside were on emergency amber, which meant main power was down to about 30%. Still running life support and basic navigation, not much else. Temperature was 11 degrees. Our breath came out in gray clouds. Rochelle took point. Mavis covered the rear. Pilar kept close to Brooke and Sean, who were running their documentation equipment and trying not to look like they were trying not to look frightened. I walked behind Rochelle and ahead of the others. I had my sidearm and a modified pulse emitter that one of the depot armory chiefs had configured for me 3 years back. When I'd started having the nightmare again, the pulse emitter was set to generate a focused electromagnetic discharge. The theory, my theory, drawn from what I'd seen at Fenris, was that K's bioluminescent filament network was essentially a biological electrical system, and that the right frequency discharge aimed at the right nerve cluster could interrupt it temporarily. Not stop it, interrupt it. At Fenris I'd had a plasma lance and 30 seconds of luck. I was hoping this time I'd have better odds. I was not confident about that. We found the first body in the engineering corridor on deck 3. It was one of the engineers, a large man, heavyset in a yellow hardsuit. His name tag said Novak. He was face down against the bulkhead, and the way his right arm was positioned, bent backward at the elbow, 90 degrees the wrong direction, told me he hadn't fallen there. Something had put him there after it was done with him. Pilar crouched over him. She said he'd been dead approximately 12 to 14 hours. She said the cause appeared to be blunt trauma to the head and neck, severe, with secondary injuries to the arms and torso, consistent with impact against a hard surface. She said it in the careful clinical language of someone who is working very hard not to say what she is actually seeing. What she was actually seeing was that something had hit this man hard enough and fast enough that he had not had time to radio for help. Something that can hit a man in a hardsuit that fast is not anything that belongs on a human warship. I knelt next to Novak and looked at what I was actually looking at, which was the secondary damage. Not the primary impact trauma, but the marks on the hardsuit's right sleeve and shoulder. The polymer of the hardsuit had been compressed and released in a pattern I recognized. Not crushed by impact against the wall, compressed by grip, by something that had held him there for a moment, and the compression pattern in the polymer showed the geometry of that grip. Fingers spread wide, more fingers than a human hand carries, each one exerting more localized pressure than a human finger can generate. K had held him for a moment before it finished. I did not say this out loud. There was no operational benefit to saying it out loud, but I filed it in the part of my mind where I keep the things that matter. Mavis found the second body 20 meters further down the corridor. One of the armory techs. Same presentation, fast, decisive, no time for a distress call. This one had managed to get a hand to his radio. The radio was on the deck 6 feet away, as if he'd dropped it in the impact. He had not pressed the transmit key. Whether that was because he'd had no time, or because Kay had done something to interrupt the action, I couldn't determine. Sean had his hand on his sidearm. Brooke had stopped documenting and was just watching the corridor ahead. I told them what I was going to tell them, because there was no longer any point in not telling them. I said, "The thing aboard this ship cannot be killed by anything you are carrying," I said. "Every weapon you fire at it will slow it down for approximately as long as it takes to recover, which early in a contact is measured in seconds, and later in a contact is measured in fractions of a second. Because it adapts," I said. "It does not experience pain the way we experience pain, which means that pain compliance is not a usable tactic," I said. "It has the combat instincts of a trained martial combatant, but the physical parameters of nothing we have a name for, and those physical parameters are not fixed. They change as it absorbs material from its environment." Sean asked what that meant. Absorbs material. I told him about Fenris. I told him what Kay had been when I first encountered it. Lean, fast, humanoid in overall shape, capable of surviving wounds that would kill a man but not dramatically larger or stronger than a large human. I told him what Kay had looked like 90 minutes later, after it had moved through the lower hold of Outpost Fenris, where there had been a full machine shop. The way the metal had integrated into its musculature. The way the hull alloy had bonded to its arm bones, extending them, reshaping them. The way it had used the mass it had taken on to hit my partner through a reinforced door. I told him Charnetsky was a warship. She had 400 meters of hull-grade alloy, reactor shielding, conduit runs, armory lockers, and structural framing. Everything Kay needed. The corridor was very quiet for a moment. Then Mavis said, "So what do we do?" I said. "We find the people who are still alive. We keep Kay away from the reactor core, and we do not let it get any bigger than it already is." Rochelle said, "And how do we do that last part?" I said I was working on it. The labor crew's manifest said 6 women. We found 2 of them in a storage bay on deck 2, barricaded behind a welded stack of equipment crates that someone had moved with real speed and real intention. A compact, fierce-eyed woman named Pilar, who turned out to be a different Pilar than our medic, which caused a brief moment of confusion, had a cutting torch in her hands and pointed it at us, before she recognized fleet insignia. The other, a tall woman named Rochelle, again different from our ranger Rochelle, was working on the door's secondary lock with a strip of conductive wire she'd stripped from the bay's lighting circuit. 2 out of 6. The compact one with the torch told me the others had gone out to check on the noise from deck 3. That had been 8 hours ago. None of them had come back. Told me she'd heard something in the corridor about 3 hours ago. Not footsteps. More like dragging. She said it had stopped outside their door for what felt like 4 minutes. She said she could hear it breathing. She said it breathed wrong. Too slow, too deep. Like something that didn't need oxygen the way she needed oxygen, but was making the motion out of habit or instinct. I asked if it had tried the door. She said no. She said she thought it had moved on. I said that was interesting, because at Fenris, Kay had also moved on from sealed rooms when it had other options. It wasn't mindless. It had priorities. And its priorities, as near as I had ever been able to determine, were expand, integrate, adapt, and then return to whatever was still alive when it was ready. The second part of that, the returning, was what I was thinking about. We found Joey in the waste processing bay. She was past helping. She was the youngest of the labor crew, barely 20. And the thing that Kay had done to her was efficient and without malice, which was somehow the worst part. It was not angry. It had never been angry. It was a mechanism, a biological weapons program that something had built, and something had lost, and something had now found, again and reactivated with the recklessness of people who did not understand what they had recovered. Talked to her. Friedel, the lead scientist whose profile was in the incident brief, the man who had apparently convinced Fleet Salvage Command that the alien insertion pod's cargo manifest was worth studying, rather than venting and burning, was not on the list of recovered survivors. His last logged position was the secondary cargo hold, Deck 4, where the insertion pod material was being cataloged. I did not need to look in that hold to know what had happened in it. But I went anyway, because I needed to know how much time we had. The secondary cargo hold on the Charnetsky was originally designed for heavy ordnance storage, reinforced decking, magnetic retention clamps, half-meter-thick blast barriers at each end. When the alien boarding action had hit, the insertion pods had targeted this hold specifically. The countermeasures had fired and sealed the blast doors before the pods could fully deploy their payload. That was the official summary. What the official summary had not accounted for was that the payload didn't need to fully deploy. It needed one breach point, one crack in the seal, 1 millimeter of access to the atmosphere on the other side of that door. Because K was not a creature, in the way that word implies a discrete biological form with a fixed body and a continuous physical presence. K was an organism that could compress itself, reduce its biological density to something closer to a vapor, a spore-rich cloud of concentrated bioactive material, and seep through small spaces and then reconstitute on the other side, quickly. It was slow, and it cost something in terms of the entity's coherence. The insertion pods had hit the hold 3 days ago. 3 days was enough time. What had reconstituted in the secondary cargo hold was not the K I had killed at Fenris. That entity had been the mature form. 5 years of growth on an alien world, fed on whatever Fenris had offered. What had reconstituted here was earlier, leaner, less integrated. The bioluminescent filaments were dimmer, firing less consistently. The musculature was dense, but the plating, the integrated metal plating that made the mature form so resistant to small arms fire, was thin, patchy, not yet fully bonded. This was a juvenile form, or a reconstituting form, or a form that had used most of what it had in the seeping through the seal process, and was now consuming the ship and the people aboard it, specifically to rebuild. And it had 12 hours of lead time on us. Friedel was in the hold, or what remained of him. He had been the first contact, the first material available for integration. I stood in the doorway and looked at what the hold had become, and I did the calculations I needed to do. The mature K at Fenris had taken 40 hours to reach its final integrated mass. I had intercepted it at the 30-hour mark. The juvenile form here had 12 hours in the hold, plus whatever it had taken from the engineering corridor and the cargo deck. Call it 15 hours total. Call it rough 40% of the way to mature state, based on the integration patterns I could see on the hold's structural members. The way the framing had been partially stripped, the alloy redistributed, the biofilament mesh spreading through the stripped sections like roots through soil. We had approximately 25 hours before it reached maturity, less if it accelerated its intake. Every weapon we fired at it would slow its absorption of ship material temporarily while it healed, which meant that conventional weapons, in this context, were counterproductive. They were buying time against themselves. I stood in that doorway for 90 seconds doing the math. Then I closed the door and went back to the others. MES found the last two survivors of the labor crew in the junction bay between decks 2 and 3. One was a woman named Joey. The other Joey, not the one we'd already found, who had managed to jam herself into a maintenance shaft and pull the access panel shut behind her, and then weld it to the frame with a wire she'd stripped from a conduit run. The other was a woman named Brooke. The labor crew Brooke, not our investigator Brooke, who had been moving through the ship in what she described as a deliberate sweep, trying to locate the others, armed with a fire suppression canister she'd pulled from the wall, and a length of conduit she'd unscrewed from a duct run. She had found 3 of her crew. She had brought them together. She had lost 2 of them anyway, in the dark, when Kay came through deck 3, and she had kept moving. I do not know exactly what to say about a woman who loses 2 people in the dark to something that moves faster than the lights can track, and then keeps moving through the same dark looking for the others. There is a word for it. But the word has been cheapened by overuse, applied to things that don't deserve it. Brooke, the labor crew Brooke, had done in the 9 hours since the salvage team went dark, was the real version of the thing that word is supposed to describe. Told her she'd done well. I told her that badly. I don't have a gift for it. She looked at me, the way that people look at you, when they don't need to be told they've done well. They need to be told what to do next. So I told her what to do next. The plan was not elegant. The plan was the kind of thing you arrive at when you have taken all the elegant options out and looked at what's left. I laid it out on the deck of the junction bay, crouching over a schematic of the Charnetsky that Brooke, the investigator, pulled from her documentation system. The schematic was the standard fleet layout for a Meridian-class destroyer, which matched what I'd memorized from the shuttle transit. The secondary cargo hold on deck 4, the reactor control bay adjacent to it, the forward pressure compartments separated from the deck 4 section by a reinforced blast door. I talked through it once, slowly, and I watched everyone's faces while I talked. This is a thing I learned a long time ago. Not to watch people's faces for approval or agreement, because in operational situations, those things are not available, and looking for them will make you soften the parts of the plan that need to be hard. I watched their faces to see if they were understanding the geometry, the spatial reality of where everything was, and what the sequence of events would look like from inside it. If a person does not understand the geometry, they make decisions based on a different map than the one you are working from. And in a tight corridor with approximately 4 seconds on the clock, different maps are lethal. Everyone understood the geometry. What was left was this. The Charnetsky's main reactor was a Type 5 heavy fusion plant, which in normal operation ran the ship's drives, weapons, and life support with power to spare. In emergency amber mode, it was running at 28%, maintaining atmosphere and hull pressure, and the emergency running lights. push the Type IV to a focused directed output, to essentially use it as an enormous directed energy weapon. You would need to be at the engineering console on Deck 4, the reactor control bay, and you would need to have someone there for approximately 12 minutes running the charge sequence. Problem with the reactor control bay on Deck 4 was that it was directly adjacent to the secondary cargo hold. K was. The second problem was that K was not going to sit in the cargo hold waiting for us to prepare the reactor. It was going to keep moving through the ship, integrating material, which meant that every hour we spent preparing was an hour of additional mass and resilience we were building into the thing we were trying to kill. Problem was that a Type IV discharge focused on the secondary cargo hold would compromise the structural integrity of Deck 4 and likely rupture the tertiary pressure vessel, which would vent approximately 60 meters of the ship's starboard midsection to hard vacuum. Anyone in that section when it blew would have approximately 4 seconds. So the plan was, get everyone not involved in the reactor, run to the forward pressure compartments, seal the blast doors, and get them to the emergency airlocks. Get Mavis and Rochelle to create noise and contact on the upper decks, drawing K upward and away from Deck 4 long enough for me to reach the reactor control bay and run the charge sequence. Get everyone else off the ship before the discharge, and then figure out. When I was sitting at the reactor console with 12 minutes on the clock and K3 bulkheads away, whether I was getting off the ship or not, I did not share that last part with anyone. There was no operational reason to. Sean said he was coming to Deck 4 with me. He said it without hedging, without performing bravery. He just said it. In the same quiet voice, he'd used the entire transit and the entire sweep through the ship. As if he'd decided it before I even laid out the plan. He said, 2 people on the charge sequence would cut the run time significantly. He was right about that. The Type EV sequence required a primary operator and a verification operator running parallel confirmation on the discharge geometry. 2 people. It was 12 minutes. Alone it was closer to 22, and 22 was not a number I had confidence in. I told him what Deck 4 was going to look like before we got to the control bay. I told him what the rupture sequence would look like at the end of it. I told him 4 seconds was not a lot of time. He said he understood. I believed him. Brooke, the investigator, handled the forward evacuation. She was good at it. She had a voice that carried, and a manner that people moved toward rather than away from. And she got the labor crew survivors and Pilar to the emergency airlocks on the forward section in under 8 minutes. She sealed the blast doors herself from the inside, which meant she was inside the forward compartment, which meant she was clear of the rupture zone if the sequence correctly. She didn't like being inside. Could tell from the way she looked at me when I confirmed the evacuation route. She was not the kind of person who moved towards safety while others went the other way. But I told her that someone had to verify the blast door seals from inside. That it wasn't about being safe, it was about the seal, and she took the job because she understood what I was doing, and she had enough dignity not to argue about it. Mavis and Rochelle took the upper decks. They had a direct radio link to me and to each other. Their job was to find K, make contact, noise, movement, whatever it took, and keep it moving upward. Away from Deck 4, give us the window. I told them not to engage it. I told them to run. Mavis said she knew how to run. Rochelle said she'd been running her whole life. She was good at it. I wanted to tell them something more useful than that. I didn't have anything. Sean and I went down. Deck 4 of the Charnetsky in Emergency Amber is a gray corridor with amber-orange lighting strips that are bright enough to read by and not much else. The deck plating rang under our boots. The ship made the sounds that ships make when they're running at partial power, and something has been moving through them. Not the normal sounds, but a version of the normal sounds with something underneath them. A resonance, a presence. The reactor control bay was 108 meters from the second secondary cargo hold access door. We covered the first 60 meters without contact. At 63 meters, I told Sean to stop. The corridor ahead of us was wrong. Not visually. There was nothing there that I could see. The deck plating, where the corridor bent right toward the control bay, had a different reflectivity than it should have, like something had laid across it recently. Like something wet and dense had rested there and moved on. K leaves a trace, not always visible to the naked eye in low light, but it leaves a biological adhesion residue, part of its integration process, the organism marking territory or tracking its own movement. I had never been sure which. At Fenris, I had started to notice it at the 11-hour mark. Here, at the 12-hour-plus mark, it would be present on any surface the entity had moved across in the last 3 hours. Told Sean what I was seeing. I told him what it meant, he said. It's been here recently, I said. Within the last hour. Maybe less, says. Is it still here, I said. I don't know. Keep moving. The reactor control bay door was sealed from the inside. Not locked, sealed. The manual bolt mechanism engaged from the interior. The kind of seal you make when you are inside something, and you do not want it opened from the outside, which meant someone was inside, or had been inside, or had engaged the bolt from outside using the maintenance bypass and then walked away. Tried the bypass, it cycled, the bolt disengaged. The control bay was small. A 12 by 12 room dominated by the reactor management console. A 3-panel array that ran the length of the back wall. The emergency lighting here was brighter than the corridor. Someone had rerouted a conduit to supplement the strip lighting, which was the kind of operational improvisation that either means a competent engineer had been here recently, or someone very frightened had been trying very hard to think. There was no one in the control bay, but someone had been running a partial charge sequence, could see it on the console. The first 4 confirmation stages of the Type IV discharge geometry protocol were already entered and locked. Someone had gotten that far and then stopped. Or been stopped. I looked at the panel for a moment. Thought about Friedel, in the secondary cargo hold, who had been a reckless man with a research objective. I thought about whether a reckless man with a research objective, when he understood what he had reactivated, might have tried to undo it. Whether he had made it this far down the corridor and this far through the charge sequence before Kay found him, and whether what he'd left on the panel was accident or intention. I decided it didn't matter. It was there. We were going to use it. I took the primary console. Sean took the verification panel on the left. I told him the sequence, and he began running the confirmations from stage 4 forward. We were going to be faster than I'd planned. My radio clicked. Mavis. She said they had contact on deck 2. She said Kay was moving. She said it was moving fast and had changed. I asked her what she meant, changed. She said it was bigger than the profiles I'd described. She said the plating on its forearms had thickened. She said it had taken something from the bulkhead in the deck 2 machine bay. She could see the stripped section, the raw framing, and she said it looked like it had absorbed it recently, in the last 2 hours. Because the integration wasn't smooth yet. She said it was moving toward the ladder access on the forward port side of deck 2, heading up. Following the noise they were making. Said good, keep moving, stay ahead of it, deck 3 or 4, she said. Understood. Sean said he had stage 7 confirmed. I had stage 8 entering verification. The console's display showed the charge build beginning. The reactor output climbing from 28%. The discharge geometry locking in, the targeting alignment calculating based on the secondary cargo hold's structural coordinates. The discharge would be focused. It would not be precise. A Type I is not a surgical instrument, but it would be intense and directional enough to cook everything in a 40-meter radius of the target point on deck 4 starboard, the secondary cargo hold, and everything between us and the hold that was within that radius. We had approximately 4 minutes of charge remaining when the corridor outside the control bay went quiet in a way that corridors do not naturally go quiet. Sean heard it too. He kept entering confirmations, his hands were steady. The door to the control bay was still open. I had not closed it because the manual bolt engaged from the inside, and I had not wanted to lock us in without knowing where Kay was. That had been a mistake. The corridor light outside the door shifted. Not the emergency amber strips. They were still running. The shift was in the quality of the shadow, in the way the darkness past the doorframe became denser, and then separated in a way that density does not naturally separate. K moved through the doorway, the way water moves through an opening, not with the discrete spatial commitment of a creature of fixed mass, but with the fluid incremental presence of something that understands its own geometry as negotiable. It was bigger than the profiles I had built at Fenris. And Mavis had been right that the integration was recent. I could see the Deck 4 bulkhead alloy worked into the structure of its right arm, silver gray against the older, darker integration of its torso, not yet smooth, still showing the weld seam patterns of the original plating. Its face was the last part of K that remained recognizably what it had once been. Eyes forward set, jaw wide, and alien bilateral symmetries that mimicked a humanoid template while clearly being derived from something that had only observed humanoid movement from the outside and built an approximation. The bioluminescent filaments in its neck and upper thorax fired in slow rhythmic pulses, dim blue-white, the color of stars dying at the edge of observable space. It moved into the control bay. I fired the pulse emitter. The discharge hit K's filament network at the left shoulder cluster. The effect was immediate and limited. The filaments in that cluster stuttered, fired wrong, and K's left arm locked up for approximately 1.5 seconds. In that window, K's movement pattern broke rhythm. It recovered. 2 steps forward, and I fired again, this time targeting the thorax cluster, and the effect was about half what it had been the first time. Sean kept running the confirmation sequence. I will say that now because it needs to be said. He kept running the confirmation sequence. K hit me across the chest with its right arm, and I went into the secondary panel array, and the impact made a sound I felt in my back teeth. I did not lose consciousness. I have a theory that my body has decided it cannot afford to lose consciousness in situations like this, and so it does not. And the cost of that decision is paid later in a currency that medicine has to manage with some care. I found my feet. My left knee buckled and then held, the pulse emitter up, and fired a third time into K's thorax. The effect was almost nothing. It had adapted. 3 discharges. 3 discharges, and it had already begun calibrating its filament network against the frequency. This was the thing that the reports had called unpredictable, and that I had always thought of as the most chilling quality the organism possessed. Not its strength, not its speed, not its capacity to absorb and integrate, but its learning speed. The way it reduced your options with the mechanical patience of a system running an optimization loop. I rolled left. K's arm hit the console where I'd been standing, and the display fractured but did not go dark. The confirmation stages were still running. Sean hit K from the right with the emergency fire suppressant canister he'd pulled from the wall. He hit it full across the left side of its head. The canister crumpled. K turned toward him, with the slowness of something that is not surprised, and has simply chosen to acknowledge you now. Sean put himself between K and the console. I do not have words for what it costs to watch someone do that. To watch someone make that choice, with full knowledge of what they are stepping in front of. I have been in enough bad places to know that this kind of thing is not common. It happens, and the people who do it do not do it because they are unafraid. They do it because they have made a calculation about what matters more than their own continued survival. And in the moment they act on it, the calculation is complete. And the fear is simply not the governing factor anymore, said Goran. Run the sequence. I ran the sequence. I got back to the primary console and entered the final confirmation stages with K 2 meters away and Sean between us. Stage 11, Stage 12, Stage 13. The console's charge indicator hit 94%. And began climbing toward the discharge threshold. K put Sean through the port bulkhead. He hit hard, he went down, he stayed down. K turned back to the console to me. I had the pulse emitter up, and I fired 4 times in sequence into the thorax cluster. And on the 4th discharge, something in K's filament network overloaded. Not calibrated out, genuinely overloaded. The accumulated frequency exposure hitting a threshold the adaptation hadn't fully processed. And for 3 seconds the entity's movement was uncoordinated, the integrated limbs firing wrong, the weight distribution going off. 3 seconds. I finished the confirmation sequence. The charge indicator hit 100%. The discharge geometry locked. K recovered its coordination and stepped forward. I hit the discharge trigger. There are things I remember clearly and things I remember in pieces. I remember the sound. Not an explosion, exactly, but a concussive pressure event that translated through the deck and the walls and the air simultaneously, the way the sea feels when something large passes through it. I remember the secondary cargo hold's blast barrier doing what it was designed to do, which was to direct force inward rather than outward, so that the discharge cooked the hold's interior rather than simply venting it. That was by design. I had entered the targeting parameters carefully. I had thought about this. I remember K in the moment the discharge reached it. The filament network lighting all at once. Every bioluminescent thread in the organism firing at peak intensity in a single involuntary cascade. The way a power grid looks when it surges before it fails. It was for approximately 2/3 of a second. The brightest thing I had ever seen in an enclosed space. It was not beautiful, but it was definitive. It was the kind of ending that leaves no room for interpretation. Remember the overpressure from the rupture sequence moving through Deck 4. And I remember making it to the corridor. And I remember the blast door at the forward end of the deck, corridor still being sealed on my side, which was the part of the plan that I had not shared with anyone. Because the blast door seal was a manual bolt engaged from my side, and the plan as I had designed it was that I would engage that bolt from my side before the rupture sequence. And then the forward pressure compartment would be protected, and the starboard midsection would vent, and the question of whether I was in the starboard midsection or the forward corridor at the moment of rupture would depend on how long the charge sequence took and how fast K moved. K had moved faster than I wanted. The charge sequence had run faster than I expected. I was in the corridor, the right side of the blast door. I engaged the bolt. The rupture sequence ran. The starboard midsection vented. The structural members that had been partially stripped by K's integration process gave way cleanly, which was the one thing I had correctly predicted about the whole operation, that K's consumption of the ship's material would weaken the sections it had moved through, and the rupture would propagate along those weakened lines, and the areas K had not moved through would hold integrity. Forward pressure compartment held. The blast door held. 4 seconds is longer than people think. If you are moving towards something rather than away from it, 4 seconds is enough time to cover a good distance. Sean was alive. That surprised me, and I will not pretend otherwise. I had seen him go into the bulkhead with enough force that I had made a private accounting of the situation, and arrived at a conclusion I was not right about. His left arm was broken in 2 places, and he had a fracture running through 3 of the left orbital bones that the medic later told me it was a centimeter from something permanent. He was concussed to the point where he did not know where he was for approximately 6 hours after Pilar got to him. But he was alive. The tow carrier's emergency team found us in the forward pressure corridor 20 minutes after the discharge. I had been sitting against the blast door with Sean's head on my kit bag and a field compress on his orbital fracture, watching his chest rise and fall, and running the math on whether the atmospheric readings I was getting from my wrist unit were accurate, or whether Deck 4's rupture had compromised more of the ventilation network than I'd intended. The readings were accurate. The forward section had held. The math had worked. The math almost never works that cleanly. I filed that in the same place I file things that matter and keep moving. I told the emergency team lead that the secondary cargo hold and a 60-meter section of the starboard midsection had been vented, and that the entity that had been aboard the ship was destroyed. She asked me what entity. I told her to read my incident report when it was filed, and to have the structural team verify the ventilated sections before anyone went near them. She started to say something about chain of command, and I told her she could write me up for insubordination after she got her people clear of the starboard midsection, and she had enough operational instinct to hear what I was actually saying. They got us clear. Sean was coherent enough to talk on the second day at Meridian Station Medical. His partner Brooke, the investigator Brooke, had not left the ward in approximately 36 hours, which I noticed without comment. She had her documentation system with her, and she had clearly been writing something. But whatever it was not the official incident report she was supposed to file. I know what official incident reports look like when someone is drafting them. This was not that. I told Sean later, when he was coherent enough to understand it, what he had done at the console. He said he remembered. I asked him what made him do it. He thought about that for a while. Then he said he'd seen the charge indicator. He said he knew there were maybe 30 seconds left in the sequence. He said he'd looked at the indicator and then looked at me and done the math about which of us was more likely to survive 30 seconds with K between us and the console, and the math had come out in favor of him being the one to be between K and the console. Said that math was charitable. He said maybe. He said he'd rather be wrong about the math and alive than right about it and the other thing. Did not have a response to that. It seemed correct. He asked me what K actually was, not what the file said, what I actually thought it was. I told him the truth. I thought it was a mistake. I thought something, somewhere a long time ago, had built a perfect weapon and then lost control of it. And the thing they had built had kept going after they were gone because that was what it was designed to do. Going, adapt, survive. I told him that the alien boarding action that had targeted the Chernetsky had not been random, that someone, some current party still in operation, had been an attempt to deploy K against a human warship, which meant that the weapon had a handler, and the handler had been waiting for the opportunity to use it. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "So ending K on the Chernetsky doesn't end it." I said, "No, it doesn't," he said. "Because whoever deployed it probably has more." I said, "That would be my assessment." He looked at the ceiling. He had the look of a man revising a calculation downward in real time. He said, "Are you going to go find them?" I said I was going to go find the recovery instances first, the 3 storage sites where additional insertion pod material was being held. He said, "And then?" I said I didn't know yet. I said I was old and my knee was bad, and I had 3 fractured ribs healing, at an angle. And at some point, even the math that had kept me functional through Fenris and the Charnetsky would come out wrong. He said he understood that. I said, "I know you do." He looked at the ceiling a while longer. Then he said he'd like to come along when his arm healed. I told him to talk to Brooke about that. He said Brooke had already said the same thing. That I had not anticipated. I filed it. Mavis and Rochelle made it off the ship. They reached the forward pressure through the deck, 3 lateral corridor. 20 minutes before the discharge, which was 8 minutes, after I had sealed the blast door from my side, and begun wondering whether I had made a good decision. Mavis said she'd heard the discharge from inside the forward compartment, and that it had sounded like the ship deciding something. I thought that was an accurate description. The labor crew survivors, the 2 women who had welded themselves into the storage bay, and the one who had been moving through the ship in the dark with a fire suppression canister, were evacuated by the tow carrier's emergency shuttle within 4 hours of the discharge. Fleet Medical handled them at Meridian Station. I do not know what happened to them after that. I know the woman with the torch and the woman with the wire were released from their labor sentences 17 months later. I know this because I asked. The woman who had been moving through the dark, the one with the conduit and the fire suppression canister, and the 9 hours of searching, and the 2 people she'd lost and kept moving anyway. I do not know what happened to her. I asked, and what I got back was a transfer notice and a sealed record. The fleet has its ways. I filed my incident report. I filed it completely and without softening, which is not always how these things go. I described the entity, its properties, its behavior, its origin as best I could determine. I described the mechanism of the discharge and the structural rupture and the conditions under which K was finally destroyed. I used the word finally with care. I am aware of what the word implies. I am aware that I have used it before at Fenris in a report that I filed with the same completeness. I am aware that between Fenris and Charnetsky, there were 5 years in which I was the only person who used the word finally, and meant it as a question rather than a statement. Commander Rella received my report. She came to see me in the Meridian Station medical bay, where I was being managed for 3 fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, a concussion that was less severe than Sean's, and the left knee, which had finally decided it was done. Pretending the gravel in a tin can sound was acceptable. She sat across from me in the same way she'd sat across from me in the commissary. Without being invited, with the carefully neutral face, she said the fleet was classifying the incident under Emergency Research Protocol 7, which meant the details of the entity, its origin, and its behavioral profile would not appear in public record documentation. I said I had expected that. She said the fleet was also initiating a new review of all alien boarding pod material currently in fleet custody or en route to fleet facilities. I said that was a good idea. She said the review had identified 3 additional recovery instances where insertion pod material had been cataloged and stored rather than vented and burned. Where? She told me. I said, how long has the material been in storage? She told me. I did the math. I did it fast, because I have done this math before, and my brain now runs it automatically. The way the body runs certain reflexes without conscious instruction. I said, how soon can you get me transportation? She looked at me for a moment. The carefully neutral face did something briefly that was not neutral, and then went back. She said, the shuttle is already staged. My left knee sounds like gravel in a tin can every time I climb a ladder. I climb a lot of ladders. I have not stopped having the nightmare. In the nightmare, K's filaments go dark one by one, and I wait, and the last one dies, and I turn around and carry my partner out. But now, in the version I have at least twice a week. Before I reach the door, I look back once more. And in the version I have twice a week, there is one filament, very small, very dim, that I missed. That is still going. I wake up from that version, and I run the math again, and I check the locations of the 3 recovery instances. And I remember what Rella said about the shuttle being staged. I have killed this thing twice. Twice is more than anyone else can say. Twice is the kind of number that becomes a fact about you. That shapes the way the brass looks at you, and the way the paperwork routes to you, and the way young officers with carefully neutral faces find you in commissaries at 0600 on Tuesdays. I don't know if twice is enough. I don't think the math favors it. If I am being honest with myself, and at my age and with my knee, and with 3 fractured ribs that have healed at an angle the medical team is carefully not making too much of, there is not a great deal of value in being dishonest with myself, but the shuttle is staged. And I have the pulse emitter. And I know something now that I did not know at Fenris and barely understood at Charnetsky. The thing is not immortal. It is not supernatural. It is a biological mechanism built by something that understood warfare as a science. And mechanisms can be interrupted, and interrupted mechanisms can be ended. And the specific nature of the interruption does not have to be elegant or fair or anything other than sufficient. Sufficient is enough. It has always been enough. I pick up the emitter. I shoulder my kit, climb the ladder to the staging bay. My knee sounds like what it sounds like. I keep climbing.